So I'll start. It's just turned 20 past. This is automating AWS with Windows PowerShell. My name's Lee Atkinson. I'm a solutions architect for Amazon Web Services here in the UK. Just before I start, could I just get an idea, how many of you are using AWS at the moment, Amazon Web Services? Okay. And of the rest, are you aware of what Amazon Web Services is, or do you want to learn a little bit? I've got a few slides to go through, so we'll go through those just to get an idea of what AWS is. So what is AWS Services? We are we provide compute services, so they can be compute, storage, it's cloud computing basically. We provide it as a rentable resource. We have the basics of compute, database, storage, and we also have higher level services, so we have things like analytics, streaming event services, mobile analytics, things like that. So one of the key things is obviously we've got a global infrastructure. So we have, around the world, we have 11 regions. A region is made up of what we call at least 2 availability zones. And an availability zone is it's designed for fault isolation. So if there was a failure in one availability zone, let's say if there's a natural disaster or something like that, the idea being that it would be isolated from the other availability zones in a region. So you can operate highly available services, and we operate highly available services provided to the customers across a single region because we're operating across multiple availability zones. An availability zone itself is actually made up of 1 or more data centers. So you can think about this as there's at least 2 data centers in every region. Quite often there's quite a lot of data centers, and depending on the region, the size can be quite big, but you've still always got the availability zones. We've also got what we call edge locations. So there's 53 of those located around the world. This is where we run our edge services, which are content delivery network called CloudFront and a Route 53, which is the DNS service. So these are operated across the globe to give low latency services to customers surrounded across the globe. I don't know if you've heard of Gartner. They do what's a magic quadrant. So they're independent analysts. They look at the market, and they did a magic quadrant based on cloud infrastructure as a service. This is the current one. It shows Amazon Web Services, as you can see in the far top left corner, top right corner. And it shows that we're a leader in cloud infrastructure as a service. In fact, Gartner, doing their research and interviewing all the providers, they stated that Amazon Web Services has 5 times the compute capacity of all the other providers together. So it shows how massive scale that we operate compared to other providers. We have over 40 AWS services. This is not all of them. We're providing sort of the basic things such as compute, storage, databases, but we're also providing higher level services such as application streaming, data warehousing, queuing services. And we also provide enterprise applications as well, such as desktops as a service or file syncing. And to give you an idea, we have currently over 1 million AWS customers at the moment. We define an AWS customer as someone that's actively used the AWS service in the last month, and that's not including AWS internal accounts. They are separate customers. We've got customers ranging from startups such as Airbnb, Tumblr, Pinterest. We've got somewhere on there, Halo, which is obviously a UK company where you can book taxis. That's operating on AWS. We also have enterprise companies such as Shell, Unilever, GE. And again, in the UK, we've got customers such as Channel 4 and News UK. So I'll just give you a brief overview of what AWS is. We're going to move on to talking about managing AWS resources. So probably the first one that most customers get to use is the web console. So this is a web-based console that you can manage your AWS resources for your account in. But there's many more different ways of interacting with our services. There is the HTTP-based API, and in fact, all other methods of controlling our resources are all based on that API. We have high-level orchestration services, so we have Elastic Beanstalk, which is an application container service. So you can write your application, whether it's in .NET, Java, Python, Go, and you can then launch that, and we will create, Elastic Beanstalk will create the whole of that stack. So it will spin up the compute resources, any load balancers, database servers, etc. There's many third-party tools, whether that's with our partners that we work with, ISVs, but it could also be open source tools as well. You look at GitHub, there's quite a lot of tools. Obviously, it's open source, try them out, see how you get, but obviously just be aware of that they are third-party tools. We also provide SDKs for developers. So these are obviously using the API, but using them for different development platforms. So that, again, it's .NET, Java, Python, Ruby, Go, JavaScript. We also have mobile SDKs for Android and iOS. We also have the AWS CLI. So this is a command line interface tool. It's cross-platform, so it will run on Windows, Mac, and Linux. We also, finally, which is obviously the whole subject of this presentation, is about the AWS Tools for PowerShell. So you could probably ask, why use the AWS Tools for PowerShell? We've got the AWS CLI that will work on Windows as well as Mac and Linux. Why should I limit myself to AWS, to the PowerShell tools? I think there's probably two main reasons. One is that it's more familiar to PowerShell users. It uses the conventions of PowerShell commandlets using the verb, noun, command naming structure. And also that it returns objects. So these are objects that you can then query and manipulate. The AWS CLI, because it's an executable, it returns text. The text can be in like a tabular form, or it can be in a JSON form that you can obviously query that JSON, but it's still text. So it's harder work to do it, but you can do it. The advantage is that it is cross-platform. But if you're building something on Windows to use, then PowerShell tools can be easier to manipulate. The one other thing I would say, that if you've got a common piece of code that's using the CLI, don't forget that you can obviously run that in your PowerShell script. The CLI itself is just an executable, so you can still do it that way. But we're going to obviously concentrate on PowerShell. So before we start, a couple of more things I just want to cover just so you understand what we're talking about. So the first one is Elastic Compute Cloud. So this is our service that we provide. It's virtual servers in the cloud. So it's you spin up a virtual machine. You can specify which operating system you want, whether it's Windows or Linux. You have control over that virtual machine. You are the administrator or the root account. We do not have access. You manage it yourself. And another service that we also provide is the Identity and Access Management Service. This is a way of you creating users and roles within your account, your AWS account, so you can specify what rights those users and roles have to interact with your AWS resources. So you can set whether they are allowed or disallowed to perform certain actions on certain AWS resources. So an action could be to create or delete something. A resource could be an EC2 instance, or it could be an S3 bucket, which is our storage service. And nearly every service has got the ability to specify rights that you can perform against the resources. The actual definition of rights access is performed in the access control policy, which is a JSON template file that you can write out. It's pretty simple to understand, and you can define and you can apply that either to your user, so you can specify what rights they have, but you can specify it to some resources, so you can say which users can apply to that resource. There's more details in that URL, but it's something you carry on with this presentation. It's something you just be aware of. But basically, it's a user control and access to your AWS account. If you spin up an EC2 instance, one thing you can do is define an IAM role. So an IAM role is like a user, but it's not attached to a physical, a human being. Typically, it's something else that performs actions on your behalf within the AWS account. So when you spin up an EC2 instance, you can specify a role. The role will obviously give that EC2 instance some rights to perform certain actions. You can specify what you want it to do. So and of course, you want to try and think about least privilege, only give the rights that instance needs to perform. EC2 will take those credentials for that role and pass it down to the EC2 instance when it first boots up. It will also rotate the credentials so that the credentials are never stale. They're changing all the time. And it just allows you so that you can securely pass those credentials to your instance without you having to manually take credentials from one place to another. You don't have to worry about the copying. It's all done by EC2 working with the instance. The SDKs, the AWS CLI and the PowerShell tools will use that instance role. You don't need to specify it when you're creating it. It will just use that by default. You can still use other credentials if you want to, if you're performing an action against something else, but by default you don't have to do it, it will just work. Obviously with machines that aren't running on EC2, we don't have instant profiles, so you have to manage getting those credentials from IAM into or onto that instance. So you have to manage the security, just like any kind of username and password. You've got to make sure that you move that into PowerShell or onto the instance. We'll explain a bit later on that PowerShell has the ability to take those credentials that you've manually moved into it and store them securely so that you can then use them without having to worry about actual storage on that instance once you've transferred them over there. So we're going to get started because we've done quite a bit of talking, 10 minutes. The first thing we're going to do is, so the PowerShell tools are something, they're installed by default on EC2 images. So if you create an EC2 instance from an Amazon machine image, which is what's used to define the root file system, effectively the operating system and what's installed on it, the PowerShell tools are installed there by default. But if you're installing it onto your own machine, you go to this URL here and it will give you the ability to download it. It's an MSI. The PowerShell tools is actually, the MSI includes the PowerShell tools, includes the .NET SDK, and it also includes the tools for Visual Studio as well. So if you use Visual Studio and install this, then you get a GUI interface within Visual Studio to manage your AWS resources. And as I said, so for EC2 machines, you're going to have to create a IAM role, and then you launch that instance with that role. And for non-EC2 machines, you're going to create an IAM user, and then when you go into the PowerShell tools for that, you're going to provide that with the credentials of that user and store that, and then you can store it as a default, so that anytime you come back and you run PowerShell commands, it will use those credentials that you stored previously. So I'm just going to go to a demo. If everything works well. Now, you probably noticed that I'm running a Mac. So what I'm going to do is use another Amazon service that we provide. It's called Amazon Workspaces. It's desktop as a cloud. So I'm using a Windows machine to actually do the demo. So hopefully everything works with the internet connection. So the first thing I'm going to do is log on to this other machine to actually. Right, so the tools are already installed in there. I've just installed the tools, so they won't actually run. The tool's been run, but there's no credentials, because this is just, although it's running in a workspace, it's just like a normal machine that you would run on your laptop or in your own data center. So it doesn't have the EC2 IAM role to actually do anything against the AWS API. So the first thing I can just do is to check that that we've got a PowerShell running. And there you are, it just shows you that it's got the PowerShell tools installed, gives you the versions. We can also look at how many services that the PowerShell tool supports. So there's about 40 services that it supports. So it's got commands for all those services. And also, just to give you an idea of how many commands we've got, if we do we should have, so we've got over 1,100 commands in total in the PowerShell tools. So obviously the PowerShell tools have got the usual get help. You can actually look at find the help of each command. It will list the parameters. It provides you quite in-depth knowledge and a database of all the information about all the commands. One other thing that's quite useful is obviously we talked about the PowerShell tools are designed for PowerShell users, which means it's using its naming conventions that fit in with the verb and noun. The actual API that AWS provides, it uses a slightly different naming convention. So it does mean that if you look at the API documentation, it might talk about a particular action that you can perform against the API. If you're wanting to see, well, what is that called in PowerShell, it may not be the same because we're trying to keep the PowerShell tools to be PowerShell friendly. We have a command which is called get AWS commandlet name API operation, and then say if we do describe instances, which is a way of basically listing your instances in your EC2 instances in your application. it actually returns, there's actually two commandlets. One is the EC2, which is get EC2 instance. This other one is opsworks, which is another service which is providing you, as I talked about before, there's like a higher level orchestration service. So opswork is a DevOps tool for managing your infrastructure running in AWS. And it happens to have a same operation within its API that's called describe instances. So it's showing you that there is two commandlets. Obviously, you would probably know that the EC2 one as a service, so you'd go that you know that get EC2 instance is the one that you want to run. Now, if I try and run that, I haven't got any credentials, so it will just be not. It will fail. It won't actually have any be not allowed. So what I need to do first is to actually provide some credentials. So the first thing I can do is set AWS credentials and pass the access key. Now I have got already installed. It's just a parameter that I've already defined. It's just so I don't show you my access key and my secret key defined in there, and a secret key. So these are the two bits that identify. These are the credentials to talk to the API. So I can just let me just get that right. So that's basically defining for this session. So if I keep that open with the PowerShell, it will remember those credentials. So now I can make AWS PowerShell calls because it's now got credentials. But if I wanted to keep that, store that sort of for the future, I can call initialize, if I spell it right, AWS defaults. So that's going to pick up my credentials what's current, and I'm going to store that so I can use for the future. One other thing I want to do, because we talked before, we've got multiple regions, we need to tell which region we want to talk to. So I will also specify the region as well. So I'm using, for this one, I'm using the Dublin region, which is called EU West 1. So now that's stored the credentials. Now I can actually do get EC2 instance. So this will list all the instances that I've got. So you can see that actually it returns groups of instances, but you can see that it's found the instances that's running in my account. There's also an object within PowerShell called AWS History. This provides the ability to actually look at your previous commands, for instance. So this lists all the commands. It allows you to see what you've done. You can see what the last response from the API for the command. It's quite useful for debugging or if you want to replay commands. It's a bit like the PowerShell history as well, but it just gives you the AWS commands. So just going back to EC2, so we're going to try and do some work against the EC2 API. I probably just mentioned this before, but if you want to create an EC2 instance, so an instance, what we call an instance in AWS is a virtual machine. And you always launch an instance, a virtual machine, from an AMI, an Amazon machine image. An AMI is a definition of a machine, so it will specify effectively the root volume, an image of the root volume that you want to boot from. So as part of the starting the instance, we will create a volume, a file system, and we will image that volume with the root volume that's defined in the AMI, and then launch that instance from that. There's also what we call a metadata web service. So every EC2 instance has a web service available. You can see the URL at the bottom. This provides information about the instance to the instance itself. You can find things like the AMI ID that it was launched from, the instance ID itself, the instance type, which is the type of virtual machine it's running on, and lots of information. This is quite useful if you're doing things on the instance itself. It's the easy way to find out information about itself. Obviously, PowerShell, we can use the invoke REST method as a way of receiving data from that. So if we go, so this time I am now, so I was using workspaces before. I've got an instance running. I will show you quickly. So this is the AWS console. So this shows all the services that are available currently on AWS. you can see it's quite a long time, and it takes quite a lot of scrolling to actually see them all. But I just want to quickly show you the IAM role that I've specified. So this is what I've launched the EC2 instance with. It's called Dev Week, and I've created a policy, and I've actually given it administrator access. Now, obviously, normally you would not do that because an EC2 instance does not need full access to every resource in your AWS account. So please use limited privileges, just the least privilege as much as possible, but I've taken the easy route because it's a demo, and I will delete it once I've finished. So I will then, so I've launched an instance already with that. If we go to remote desktop, so this is logging in over remote desktop into the instance. Aha. Already running. So this is running on EC2 itself, and so I can now make a call directly. I don't need to give it an instance AIM credentials because it's already got that, so I can just run a call and it will just return data. I can also actually, so the EC2 instance is there running, as you can see, and I will so you can there see information about the instance, so I can then look at the instance ID, for instance. So it gives you the instance ID, and it gives you a lot of information about the instance. Now, if I want to launch an instance, I need to find out an AMI that I want to launch it from. We've got, within PowerShell, we've got the ability to actually find details about a Windows instance. So if we go here, this was actually find the AMI for, as you can see, Windows 2012. That's just finding details about that particular AMI. If I return it, it shows you the details. It will show you things like the AMI ID itself. I can then launch instances from that. So this will launch, it will launch 2 instances from that AMI. You can see that it's a new EC2 instance. It launches an instance type of T2.medium. So that's a particular instance machine type. It's a specification of RAM and storage and CPU power. I'm specifying with the min and the max count that I want 2 instances. And this instant profile name is the dev week profile. So that's launching with that IAM role. If we look at the inside the EC2 console on the web, you can see that these 2 instances are just starting up. So it'll take a while for them to boot up. We can also do things like tagging that instance. So a tag within AWS is a way of tagging a resource so that you can identify that particular resource, maybe assign it to a particular project. It helps with billing because then you can build up a billing amount for that particular project. You can also do that within the PowerShell tools as well. With get back. So that's with EC2. My final one of the demonstrations is to talk about Amazon S3. So Amazon S3 provides a highly durable, highly scalable object storage. It's designed for 11 nines of durability, and it's designed for 4 nines of availability. And it's a storage service that you can use, and you only pay for what you store. So if you're storing only 1 kilobyte of data, then you're only paying for that. If you're storing 10 petabytes, you're paying for 10 petabytes. So I'm going to just do a very quick demo. So again, I'm going to do it on the workspace. Somewhere. There we are. So So I'm just going to randomly create a 1 gigabyte file. So that's just creating a 1 gigabyte file on my local drive, just as something to upload. The next thing I'm going to do is to upload that file to S3. I'll start that up and I'll just explain. So this is uploading the 1 gigabyte file. It's using, the command is write S3 object. What it's doing is, because it's quite a large file, it's actually parallelizing the upload. It's using what's a feature called multi-part upload. So rather than uploading one file as a whole in one go, we're actually uploading in parallel multiple parts of that object. And once the file's uploaded, we're then joining that file back together into one object. And that's all been done by the PowerShell tools. You just specify write S3 object and it will manage that multi-part uploads for you. So it makes it a lot quicker. So that's just been uploaded. If I quickly look at the S3 console, so this is Amazon S3 has the concept of what's called a bucket. So that's really just a storage container. I've created just one bucket called Dev Week Demo. Inside there, this is the object I've just uploaded. You can see that it's approximately 1 gigabyte. And it was just uploaded, just a few seconds ago. So that's a way of uploading the object directly into S3. Again, you can manage the objects. I've only actually shown you a demonstration of EC2 and S3. Obviously, it's only half an hour, and I wanted to go through some of the introduction of how to set up your PowerShell tools. The key thing with PowerShell tools is it supports pretty much all the services of AWS that's got an API. So it's well worth investigating all the services and understanding all the different things so you can do databases and analytics and data warehousing and looking at the PowerShell tools and how that can help you automate your workflow and your processing of managing your AWS resources. The web console is great for viewing stuff and for doing sort of basic stuff, but you don't want to be, it's better to the repeatable stuff that you need to do, you want to be using something like scripting rather than using the console, especially when you get to a scale of running potentially hundreds of servers. The PowerShell tools is going to be a lot easier and a lot quicker for you to manage. My final slide is just really just a few links. So we have the AWS website, aws.amazon.com. Off that, we've got the PowerShell tools where you can download. It's also got documentation on how to install it and also the reference on the commands. We have the main AWS blog that blogs about sort of every feature. There's probably a new feature being released nearly every day, at least once a day. The AWS.NET blog, it's more than .NET, it will talk about PowerShell, so there's a lot of tips there for PowerShell users on the .NET blog, as well as for Windows. So although it's called the .NET blog, it does have a lot of information about for Windows and PowerShell users as well. We have a Twitter account, and obviously we're actually here today and tomorrow. We've got a table at the far end, so please come and say hello. I will be here for the rest of today, and I'll be here tomorrow as well. That's it. Left corner, top right corner, and it shows that we're a leader in cloud infrastructure as a service. In fact, Gartner, doing their research and interviewing all the providers, they stated that Amazon Web Services has 5 times the compute capacity of all the other providers together. So it shows how massive scale that we operate compared to other providers. We have over 40 AWS services. This is not all of them. We're providing sort of the basic things such as compute, storage, databases, but we're also providing higher level services such as application streaming. We are we provide compute services, so they can be compute, storage, it's cloud computing basically. We provide it as a rentable resource. We have the basics of compute, database, storage, and we also have higher level services, so we have things like analytics, streaming event services, mobile analytics, things like that. So one of the key things is obviously we've got a global infrastructure. So we have, around the world, we have 11 regions. A region is made up of what we call at least 2 availability zones. And an availability zone is it's designed for fault isolation. So if there was a failure in one availability zone, let's say if there's a natural disaster or something like that, The idea being that it would be isolated from the other availability zones in a region. So you can operate highly available services, and we operate highly available services provided to the customers across a single region because we're operating across multiple availability zones. An availability zone itself is actually made up of one or more data centers. So you can think about this as there's at least 2 data centers in every region. Quite often there's quite a lot of data centers, and depending on the region, the size can be quite big, but you've still always got the availability zones. We've also got what we call edge locations. So there's 50. So I'll start. It's just turned 20 past. This is automating AWS with Windows PowerShell. My name's Atkinson. I'm a solutions architect for Amazon Web Services here in the UK. Just before I start, could I just get an idea, how many of you are using AWS at the moment, Amazon Web Services? Okay. And of the rest, are you aware of what Amazon Web Services is, or do you want to learn a little bit? I've got a few slides to go through, so we'll go through those just to get an idea of what AWS is. So what is AWS Services? 53 of those located around the world. This is where we run our edge services, which are content delivery network called CloudFront, and a Route 53, which is the DNS service. So these are operated across the globe to give low latency services to customers surrounded across the globe. I don't know if you've heard of Gartner. They do what's a magic quadrant. So they're independent analysts. They look at the market, and they did a magic quadrant based on cloud infrastructure as a service. This is the current one. It shows Amazon Web Services, as you can see in the far top left.